Hello, folks. My name is Robert Kabushenga, and I would like to welcome you to this week's edition of The Bad Natives. I am currently in Kampala.
Hi everyone, I'm Adeswagiwa Osage and I'm in Lagos.
Charles Onyango Obo. I'm in Nairobi.
Good day, everybody. I'm Ferial Hafaji in Johannesburg.
Fantastic. Everyone is here, and this is The Bad Natives. This is where Africa meets the world. And in case you're seeing this for the first time, the thing you need to do is knock that subscribe button so that you don't miss the notifications when each edition is up, and then follow and spread the word, because this is how the conversation reaches more people. This is probably how you got to hear about Firio, about Adesua, and a certain notorious man in Nairobi called Charles. So please subscribe, press the button, and make sure that you don't miss the notifications. So folks, Africa never stops serving up interesting political stories. And there is one country which, for the longest time, never makes much news. And until recently, when a coup took place, the news out of that country was not that the coup took place, it was the reaction of the ex president who had been overthrown. And that country is Gabon. And when the incumbent president, was overthrown by his cousin, who was the head of the presidential guard, Origi Nguema, uh, Ali Bongo then recorded a message for the world and let it out on the internet. Adesua, did you catch that?
Is it the one where he was for asking for his wife or another one?
No, there was one. Charles is laughing because he knows what the guy said. So this is the irony of
When he
it.
was asking us that we should make noise,
Yes.
Ah
so
yes. Oh, that one. Of course, of
make
course,
some noise, that
of
it became
course.
a huge meme.
so
Hmm.
Furio, what was very interesting is that this guy, in order to rig the election, had switched off the internet. So when the coup took place, now he realized the importance of the internet, and then he went online and started screaming, asking us to make some noise so that the coup could be overturned, his wife could be freed, his son would also be set free. Unfortunately, poor guy, that became a joke, and everybody was just laughing about it and felt that he deserved it. But I want to come back to what this represents. So this week, I think it was, or last week, there was an election in Gabon in which the leading candidate was General Nguema, who had taken over, and he, surprise, scored 90.35 of the vote as the winner, according to their election. So, Charles, I'm sure that's not a surprise to you. But what is curious is that he was part of a spate of coups that characterized Francophone Africa as it is known. How come this guy opted to go for an election where the others are busy forming trade blocks, setting up tariffs, and generally running around in army fatigues? Why do you think Nguema found it were necessary to carry out an election? Why was he so confident?
It's a mystery. But you see, the thing is that the Gabon, right from Ali Bongo, who ruled, I don't know, for 40 something years, and then Ali Bongo, no, Onomar Bongo, and then Ali Bongo. It's been, you know, their dictatorships are not the extreme ones. They are not the ones who feed people to crocodiles. The ones we are talking of last week. They are not the ones who keep heads in the fridge and check out. So the Gabon's politics has been generally, you know, you know, you know, the dictatorship has been of a mild variety. But 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 if you look at the numbers, it has the highest per capita GDP of all those those two countries. I think it has one of Africa's top five highest GDP per capita. Rather, let me clarify that. And it is a small country. It is nearly 85% of it in forest, and so the population is concentrated in a few pockets. And and one of the things what Brice Nguema, where he differs from the other Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, is that he's actually fairly conservative guy politically. He is not. He's not. He is not a radical. And you you are the one who shared the video of him dancing. He's a populist. He's a people's man in a very strange way. And although they did lock out some candidates from the election, what is surprising is he seemed people seem to genuinely love him. Eh? If he had to steal the election, then he didn't really steal too many votes. And which comes to the question which we are now seeing, because studies from barometer and all that are showing us that we have what we would actually call an authoritarian drift even amongst voters in Africa. That many because of the disillusionment with democracy, many parts of Africa now, the people prefer strongmen. So it's actually good. It is a good season to be a Brice Nguema. It is not a good season to be a Bobby Wine or a Elizabeth.
Or in the case of Nigeria, a Natasha.
Is this in relation to strong men? Because I think Natasha herself is a strong. She's a strong woman. I will say that much.
No, but what Adesua, what what for me was interesting from what Charles is raising is, you know, to what extent is an election in Africa a reflection of the people's will? In this particular case, we've seen Gabon, and for me, I'm not surprised. I think actually Nguema overthrew his cousin for totally different reasons than the other West African countries or Francophone countries. I think he was trying to save the family control of the state from a guy who had suffered a stroke, had been in hospital for over a year, and could hardly walk. By the way, he went for Prince Charles's coronation. He was limping his way into Buckingham Palace. So the question to you is, what would be the lessons that we can draw from the experiences of West Africa? I am particularly intrigued by countries like Ghana, Senegal. Even for Senegal, when it gets violent, the opposition seems to give as good as it gets from the state, and eventually it prevails in terms of the outcome. From your vantage point in that part of the world, what are the things we can learn from such countries? Cape Verde, what do they get right and are able to deliver the will of the people? I mean, Ghana is a very interesting one. It's gone back and forth between two parties for the last almost 35 years.
Well, since 2001, yeah, it's like 24 years. But it's the same story in Nigeria. It's only been the PDP till it was the APC, and now it hasn't gone back yet since the first peaceful transition of power from one party to another, which we had in 2015, and that was a huge deal, from Jonathan to Muhammad Buhari, and that was another case of the population looking for a strong man. Buhari was seen as he's an ex-general. He was seen as the anti-corruption star, as a no-nonsense leader. Obviously, he really swindled us with that one, but that was the idea. Nigeria was looking for a strong man, and particularly with the rise of Boko Haram at that point in time, with the insurgency, and you know Buhari presented as this strong man that would lead us out of, terrorism and insurgency and into a land of milk and honey. Obviously, that did not happen, but that was the belief then. Across West Africa, we're also seeing this move, particularly in terms of anti-imperialist sentiment. Right, and so even with Gabon, you have Nguema nationalizing certain assets, right, and so there is a anti-imperialist movement going on across West Africa to different degrees, even in Senegal to some way. Now, with Ghana, Ghana is very interesting, right? Because now Ghana is seen as, and they have functioned as a democratic stalwart in a region that has been going towards like autocracy and strong men. Ghana has been this important democratic beacon of light, right? But that wasn't the case for a very long time, right? And even Rawlings, who is the person who, went from the military leader to the democratic leader of Ghana, he came up through a palace coup. And I think that's what we keep seeing in West Africa is palace coups, right? It's always from the inside. Rawlings' coup is a bit different, I think, because he came up from the lower tiers of the military. But even in Niger, it's really a palace coup, right? It's an inside job. With Bongo and Nguema, you do see it's as say Palace Coup, right? It's as you said, it's within the family. I think this it has a lot to do with structure. You know, Ghana is it's sometimes I feel like it's luck, right? It can be, and I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's true because those institutions, for the best part, like Ghana's, electoral commission or Nigeria's electoral commission, you look at the independence of those bodies, right? And sometimes it's the institution and it's the structure, but it's also the luck of who's in power and how they view the importance of these institutions. If Mahama had, you know, diminished the electoral commission in Ghana in order to retain power when he was voted out, he wouldn't have been able to be voted back in just now, right? And so you sometimes you're grateful for some long-term thinking in with the people in power.
And the culture that is established, the political culture that's established over a period. Uh, you see the same thing in Botswana and Firio, two very interesting countries that have are going through elections or have gone through elections. So you have one of the most interesting things I watched was the swearing in ceremony of the current Ghana president of Botswana. It was three people. It was him, his wife, the chief justice, and the former president. Actually, there was just four of them, and it was a very simple ceremony, uh, done away with and finished. Then, right across the border in Zimbabwe, you've got this unending culture of civil war in terms of political civil war. I mean, there's violence. How does a country like Botswana manage to get it right in a region where the election, I mean, we saw what happened in Mozambique. I mean, it was so violent, and then people fled. So tell us, what does Botswana manage to do in order to get the will of the people reflected in its elections?
Uh but Bob, before you put me on the spot, you yourself,
Yeah, what do you want to ask me, guys? Okay, I'm willing to talk.
you
Yeah,
are
I was
you are
hiding
sitting
from
in you
in a
are
cold room.
I mean, you keep an eye on Tanzania as much as I do, but
Yes.
I mean, before I speak to the question of whether
Mm,
the whole idea that women would leaders would save us from dictatorship, whether that has gone up in smoke. What do you actually say? Because if where you sit and you've
yes.
done some work on this,
Yeah.
all you Kenya is almost the exception. So what happens? What's going to happen in Uganda? What why is it you think, even before you talk of CCM, that it's now the longest ruling party in Africa? It's
Yeah.
not going to be ousted. What
No.
what are you seeing in this? Because Pharaoh talk, in you can talk of Southern Africa, and you can find a basket of countries which are democratic or moving there. You can talk of West Africa, And even though you have extremes, you have a basket. But if you look at East Africa, actually, you don't have a basket. eh.
No,
You just have this single fruit sitting on the table. What
no.
what is your reading?
You know, I'm going to start it from a completely different angle. So when I saw the outcome of the election in Gabon at 90%, it reminded me of the kind of vote that Kagame gets in the election in Rwanda. Now you can discuss it any other way, but what has happened is that there is some similarities between Kagame and Nguema. For some reason, not for some reason, they've been able to make their countries work for the broader population. And therefore, amongst young people, both of them have created the expectation that there is hope, that where this leadership is taking us is where we want to go. So Kagame has, along with Nguema, have managed to persuade their voters that we're the ones who are going to take you to the promised land. So that's where they get their legitimacy. So, in a sense, it's more than a vote, it's a legitimization process where people genuinely say, this is the leadership we want for the country. And people outside can say all the things they want to say about the nature of the vote and the size of the vote. But there is an underlying political process of promise. On the contrary, and this is where the problems begin for the other three East African countries. I'm not even putting in South Sudan because South Sudan is a gone case. I'm talking about Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. The political establishment in those three countries is either failing to acknowledge or failing to come up with a mechanism to deal with popular grievance. You can see that sections and big sections of the population are unhappy with the political establishment and would like to see a change. But the political establishment, for their own selfish reasons, wants to maintain power at every cost. That cost has been financial, so they've been buying off people or hoping to buy off people. When that fails, they return to some sort of violent reaction to try and suppress this demand for change. If you look at Kenya, you have this disappearance of young activists who are demanding for change. If you look at Uganda, you see these beatings during by elections or long detentions of people with contrary political views. When you go to Tanzania, which was last week, they broke up the public rallies of the opposition leader and have arrested him to take him out of the election. And I think for me, the problem there is that the political establishments, whatever you want to call them, whether it's political parties or what, have run out of political imagination in order to deal with the grievances. But tied in with that is the unresolved question. This one, unlike Ghana, East Africa has an unresolved question of how you manage succession. Uh, in Ghana, Mahama was willing to wait because he knew within 8 years he will be back. In our part of the world, you can never be too sure. Once you're out, you may be out forever. So the contestation becomes violent. Now, for the Ugandan case, I think we had a by-election in a part of Kampala City that was terribly violent. Even by our violent standards, this was extreme. It was excessive. What was very interesting was not the violence, although I'll talk about it, but that it failed in its intended outcome because somebody I spoke to said to me, look, Robert, we want, the intention was to force a low turnout because of fear. And they had hoped that a low turnout would work for the incumbent government. Instead, even with that low turnout, the opposition still won. But what I read into it is that in the 2026 election, because we have our election in at the beginning of 2026, but the campaigns start in about 3 or 4 months' time, that process is going to be excessively violent. That we can be sure. We've got a taste of. But also, Charles, what I'll say to you is that, but to your question is that we don't have in East Africa CCM is the only organized party, if you want to say that. But what you have are political factions, and each of them trying to maneuver for political advantage in very unorthodox ways. So those who control means of violence will apply violence, those with money will apply money, those with other methods will apply them. So we don't have a formal process by which people contest for power. Everybody is just using underhand methods. So that's why, at least in the three East African countries, you see an exceedingly violent process. And unfortunately, violence begets violence. And even those who are opposed are learning that the only way they can preserve themselves is to be violent. So I may sound pessimistic, but I am not. Why am I not pessimistic? Because when people are very clear about what their grievances are, even the most violent election, even with the most egregious attempts at rigging the election, you will still see that the dissent will come through. And that's what happened in Kampala. That even with those beatings, even when they deployed so much money and government officials, the opposition still won. So that's where, for me, I feel that unless the political establishment comes up with a political mechanism of addressing grievances across the board, the change will still happen. It's just that the will of people will be reflected. And I actually expect, Charles, that in Uganda, the whole parliament will be swept out, actually. And I think Museveni has just made a very big mistake. He gave Firio, you want to hear this? Museveni gave all the MPs of his party 100 million shillings, which is the equivalent of about $30,000 as a gift because they had voted well on some bills. So when the public went berserk about it, he wrote a letter saying that that money is meant for MPs so that their constituents can borrow from them for development to invest in. But you see, that for me was a death sentence because now the public is just going to say, "You got 100 million, give us our part." So I think he sunk them not just by giving them money, but by admitting, because they had denied, but by admitting that he gave them the money and that the purpose was to help the constituents. So I think for me, just to sound sort of, Charles, to round off, is that in our part of the world, you're going to have its politics has become transactional. It's going to be either force or money. There is no ideology, there is no conviction anymore. And but that doesn't mean that there are no grievances. And that's why I was taking you, Charles, to Tanzania, because what was interesting was the reaction of the public to the behavior by CCM or the government of Tanzania in detaining Tundu Lissu, who is the opposition leader for the opposition party of Chadema.
Yeah, and so not only, I mean, a few days after they detained Tundu Lissu, and his crime was actually he asked for a political reform. I mean, it's very interesting. So a few days later, they actually banned the party Chadema from standing for election, ostensibly because they refused to sign on the code of conduct of the election, which hadn't made the reform they were asking for. But but Tanzania demonstrates what happened, and they are really in difficulty here because CCM is the Africa's longest ruling party, continuous ruling party. It has baked in a lot of one party aspects into the politics. So that is going to be very, very difficult uh, to deal with. The other problem that they have is there is very sharp contestation within the faction. So just like Magufuli, presidents have to resort to extreme measures, not just in terms of dealing with the outside threat, but also the internal threat. But having said that, Bob, with all the problems you're saying, Kenya is still different. So, for example, in Kenya, you wouldn't arrest an opposition uh, leader. In Kenya, it is the only one of the East African community countries, if you exclude the Somali territory, which has had a transition from one political party to another in power. And Kenya it is very transactional in a sense that there is this tradition of handshakes and and deal making that literally every time everyone loses an election, you can expect that there'll be a post-election pact in which they get a piece of the action. So that has been able to make sure that it doesn't go to the extreme, very brutal way that you see in some of the countries. And the reason for that is that, and this will now, I mean, I guess we can hear from Ferrell and the on this. I don't know what to think of that. Kenya politics is driven a lot by ethnicity, but they have also found the formula for harnessing ethnicity to make it work. Because there is a thinking in African politics that where other structures are very weak, where parties are weak, that actually tribe has become the greatest democratic counterforce against dictatorship.
I would
You
rather
know, I
let
find it.
Adesua deal with that because she's the one who is the young person here. The rest of yeah.
I, I Now, I was going to say that I find this conversation about tribe very interesting. Um, even in the Senator Natasha situation, a lot of the politicians look at it as a tribal thing. They believe that it's a northern agenda, and northerners don't like the Senate president who's from the South South. That Atiku, the former vice president, supported Senator Natasha because he's a northerner and she's a northerner, and so you see that even these tribal sentiments play out in the most unexpected of places in Nigeria. Right? It's a lens or a framework with which to view everything. And even if it doesn't fit in that lens or framework, people will make it fit or can only view it through those actual lenses which they operate. Obviously tribe is huge in Nigeria. Region is also huge because we it's like a power sharing agreement between the north and the south, which was formerly the northern protectorate of the Niger and the southern protectorate of the Niger. Lagos was its own colony, which is why we've always been different around Lagos, because Lagos has always been its own thing. But now there's an amalgamation of Nigeria, and people are trying to deal with these new not even new, because even in the most recent elections we've been seeing new iterations of what it is to be a member of a tribe come out, right? We now have a new movement of purists who believe that both your mother and father have to come from the same tribe in order for you to be considered a member of that tribe. I think that's new in yes, so it's it's so bizarre for people who intermarry and who are interreligious to have these movements. Now, these are minority movements, but they are very loud minorities. And I think they're infiltrating. It's how the Tea Party movement started as this cookie movement to the right in the Republican Party, and then a decade later you end up with a Trump, right? Is that if you have a very vocal minority, they shift the conversation. I think also, when it comes to this idea of young people and hope, it's one thing that I saw in Ghana is that the young people in Ghana, like my Ghanaian friends, believed in their vote. They believed in their system, right? So even if they didn't like the government of the day or they didn't like the politics of the day, they believed in their power as a citizen to change it or to affect change. That really does not exist in the Nigerian consciousness. I don't know. I would say it also doesn't exist in Rwanda, but I don't want to get into it because I'm afraid of the big man in Rwanda. But um, I'm afraid of the big man in Rwanda. But I will say that, this idea when it comes to your own individual power as a citizen, um, believing in the process. I don't think we have it in Nigeria, how they do in Ghana, how they do in Senegal. And so that also depresses voter outcome. You don't have to be violent if people believe that even if I come out and vote, they're going to just change the number at the end of the day, right? So I think these things play into it. But Farrell, one thing you said that for me, it's something I've been working on. I've been thinking about and writing up is the importance of the judiciary. For me, the failure of the Nigerian judiciary, I think, is actually the cornerstone of our story and our problem as a nation. I think the Nigerian judiciary has failed the Nigerian constitution, the Nigerian people. And if we had that right, if we had the judiciary right, I think we would be in a much better place today.
Okay, I wanted to take it up, Pharaoh, from the point you made earlier about some of the thinking we see from the Mo Ibrahim, Foundation on Democracy in Africa, which tends to basically parallel, in many respects, with what the Afrobarometer says. Seeing this return to you know, uh, this the fascination with the populist and autocrat. But before we go there, if you look at the uh, freedom in the world, for example, this report from Freedom House, it categorizes 8 African countries as free. And what are those countries? Botswana, Cabo Verde, Ghana, Lesotho, Mauritius, Namibia, Sao Tome and Principe, and Seychelles. Now, the majority of those countries are generally small countries. So, is there something about Africa where we see that the smaller countries, either in size or population, tend to be much more successful democracy models? Is it that and in many ways Gabon is like that? It's a small country, so it might have been easier for Brice Nguema, to hold an election earlier. Is there something to be said about these factors that we tend to see greater success amongst the smaller countries, and the bigger ones struggle, in a very major way, barring perhaps South Africa and Nigeria, which muddle along.
Tell
Exactly.
us, what do you think? You're from a large country.
You know how in with the banks there was like they were seen as too big to fail, and then the we had the whole world recession. Sometimes within African countries, I think it's the opposite. It's seen as too big or too complex to succeed because of all these factors we've spoken about: the Berlin Conference, the different tribes, the different religions. You're dealing with so many different people who technically, had different styles of governance, different religions, and they've been hacked together in a very on in a very strange way. When we talk about even Namibia is smaller than Lagos population wise, at least. So when you think about the complexities, yeah.
Yeah, that is all of that. Right?
Yes, maybe I'll fit in Lagos twice, but like you would. But when you talk about the complexities of dealing with that many people, that many tribes or religions, belief systems, when you talk about the fact that our resources, we're fighting for resource control, in very significant ways, right? I think the larger countries have a lot to deal with, and even if we look at Europe, I mean, it's not like democracy is thriving there either. Even in Latin America, it's not thriving. Even America, who gave it to everyone, has now dealt, faced with Trump, who is pretending that the Supreme Court ruled in his favor when it comes to the case of the man in Maryland, the men they mistakenly deported from Maryland to El Salvador, unanimously against him, pretending otherwise. And this is the Supreme Court of America, the oldest democracy in the world, like something we could not have fathomed. 12 years ago that an American president will sit with the president of El Salvador, and both of them will mock a, some a judgment coming out of the American Supreme Court. And so even in a country where you see institutions that you think are too big to fail, you realize that
I
sometimes it's luck. I don't know. I
I
do
want
think that,
to,
yeah.
Charles, the issue that you raise, especially about small countries. I wanted to just bring to your attention small countries that are a complete mess. I mean, Burundi is one of them, and it has had uh, orgies of violence. The other one is Equatorial Guinea, where in fact the forest is reclaiming the country rather than the other way around. But I think where these the reports, like the studies that are done, I think there's a massive failure, one of the African intellectual class to correctly analyze the forces that drive our politics. But also, I feel that we're trying to fit our politics in paradigms that don't actually work. And I want to give a very, very interesting example, Charles, to make my point. If you go and marry as a man from a family of people who are very self confident and have a strong tradition in their family of the women asserting themselves, and they are, they've been exposed and have had education. And Adesua, I'm talking here about the Kuti family, for instance. It's going to be very difficult for you to abuse somebody like Adesua. It's going to be extremely difficult for you to mistreat an Adesua if you marry her, because she comes from a culture of self confidence, a culture where generally women are respected and so on. So you're going to look at me and say, Robert, what does that got to do with politics? And it's very simple, that one of the things that I feel is important is we don't look at the political culture of a country. Let's take South Africa, for instance. After years of resistance and protest and fighting, there is a certain level of civic awareness in the larger population. And in my view, that's why Zuma failed. It was possible to fight Zuma in a way that it was not possible for the Zimbabweans to fight Mugabe, because the general population had been involved in the politics of resistance and protest in a way that the Zimbabwean population never was. Because the Zimbabwean change of government came as a result of a guerrilla war, which in most cases involves very few people. I guess my point is we need to look critically at the political culture that is built. There is the question of institutions, yes, but there is also the culture. And that takes me back to Charles, what you said, that with time, Kenya built its politics on two traditions or on two cultures, a culture of tribalism and a culture of business. So the Kenyan political establishment is perhaps the most effective horse trading political establishment on the African continent. No guy beats those guys in political deal making. But what has ended up happening is that the tribal unit as a small unit of political organization has actually matured to a point where now people begin to see that yes, you can actually get concessions from the state. You can actually control the excesses of the state and the strongman element by bunching together as a tribe. So it may not be such a bad idea actually as a unit of political organization. And then you go to Tanzania and it's different. And in Tanzania, it's different because the minimum political unit of organization was structured by Ujamaa. So you have to look at the Nyerere, the political culture, post independence political culture that was built. In Uganda, we built a culture of violence right from 1966. I mean, right through, we have had a long culture that political change happens violently. So everybody doesn't see the need for negotiation and horse trading. So I guess the long of this submission is really that we need, and any studies and any analysis needs to look at the independent political culture. When I talked about Namibia, one of the most interesting things was the culture of SWAPO. There was a collectivism about SWAPO and how they made decisions. There was a collegiality about the political leadership. You didn't have a strong man. Nuyoma was the first amongst equals. If you look at Cape Verde, which was originally part of Guinea Bissau, the thugs belonged to Guinea Bissau. The intellectuals were from Cape Verde. So when there was a breakup, the intellectuals went and continued the intellectual political tradition, and the thugs took over Guinea Bissau. If you look at the political tradition of Senegal, if you look at the political tradition of Algeria, and you look, I mean, part of the reason Libya collapsed and Egypt didn't was you had the culture of a strong man. So those are the things that I think, in looking at our politics, we need to look at the culture. To what extent or how are political decisions and choices made? One of the interesting things, and this is my final point on this about Uganda, is that while we look like we are a strongman country, one of the most interesting outcomes is that every single election since 1996, the parliament has been wiped out by 70%. All incumbents, 75% of them never return. What's interesting is that that's where the population goes to protest about things they don't like. They say, we cannot remove Museveni, but we are going to punish him by taking away a lot of his people. So I actually suspect that in this coming election, 95% of the NRM, the current members of parliament, will not return.
Absolutely right that we might do with a deeper understanding and exposition of political cultures in order to understand things. But I feel like that only gets you so far, is that we actually have to look at institutional creation, and that we often have to turn our minds as democratic activists, as thinkers, journalists, to how we break some of those cultures. And what I also wanted to pick up on was something you said at first, is what about the inherited norms and standards that may not work for us? Like, it's a bit, I know it's a heresy to say here, but maybe the 2-term limit isn't working in many post colonial democracies, and it is an inherited practice, because in South Africa, what it's meant is we are constantly in electioneering mode, is that you have no time to sink these institutions and to perhaps begin to implement, using a strong civil society, some very good ideas, because next thing you look, the next election is coming. And it's to those kind of things that I'd also like to turn our thoughts beyond a very interesting understanding of
Charles,
political
as a way
cultures.
of winding up, um,
Which,
as a
which
way of winding up, can we look at, for instance, lengthening the term rather than having these short presidential or government term limits? But can we also devolve more power away from the state? Maybe.
yeah, I'm one of those who used to be a term limit fundamentalist. I think, I think I've been chastised. I have, I have, I'm willing to go with Verve on this. I still think we should have term limit, but perhaps not two. Two doesn't work, and then also I think that it shouldn't, maybe 4 years like in South Africa also doesn't make sense. The but sorry, Nigeria. So give them three. I think we go to three. Uh,
In Nigeria, in the National Assembly now, there's a suggestion. I think it's one term, but 5 years or 6 years, something like that.
so 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 I think that there is that. There is also pero, I mean, I do agree with you that we have to look at constitution, but the question, so it is how is it, for example, that Kenya can have a judiciary that overturn an election, and South Africa has got a strong judiciary and others don't. So whereas yes, the institutions are there, which there, where does it begin? Where does the process that build that institution begin from? And then the third issue, which I would want to speak to, touching on what Robert had said, is some of these initial conditions. And I don't know whether you you bad native have noticed that in political theory has argued that the homogeneity of a country is an advantage for politics. That you tend to have stable and perhaps even more democratic. But that's the theory. If you look in Africa, which are some of the most homogeneous countries in terms of culture, and Somalia, and went so badly. Rwanda is basically one language, one culture. We had the genocide. Burundi, it is the same. Most of the Arab countries speak the same language. There is no North African democracy. Sudan, the, the same thing. So while it is absolutely key, I think institutionally the way we work our way out of it. We have also to look at some of these other conditions. Why is it that they don't work for us, and they have seemed to work for others?
So, guys, my own suggestion would be have a 7 year presidential term, have a 3 year parliamentary term, put term limits on parliamentarians, don't put term limits on presidents. Because by 14 years they'll be completely exhausted anyway, or so we hope. But I guess that's wishful thinking. Um, but one of the things I think we need to do mostly is to really go back to our political history. We also need to examine the qualifications of political leadership in our parts of the world. I think we get some of the really worst people in public office and so on. But hey, guys, let's start winding up. And I want to start with you, Firio. What's your event of the week?
My event of the week is in Lesotho, where the country gave Starlink the right to enter. They'd been wanting to do so. But why this is important, you'll remember that Lesotho got hit with some of the highest US tariffs for a tiny economy. And it was also the country insulted by Donald Trump in one of his posts. So for me, this small Southern African nation is even bearing the brunt of the transactionalism of the USA at the moment. And I found that remarkable to observe.
I am torn.
Mhm.
I'll take two shots. One is the story that really depressed me out of South Africa. There is this 14-year-old rape victim. She committed suicide because her trial has dragged
Wow.
on for 8 years. In other words, she was raped by three men when she was 7. And she could no longer take being interrogated in court. And what happened when she committed suicide? The case was dropped because under South African law, you have the right to examine your accuser. So because the accuser had committed suicide, these guys were let off the
Wow.
hook. I mean, that is terrible. But because of that depressing story, I needed a light moment, and it's you know the not just recently in Kenya there was this case of this gentleman stole a phone, so the crowd chased him as they tend to do around many African towns, and then he ran and hid in a police station. So nothing very untoward. So the crowd that was chasing him gathered outside the police station. And so they
Mhm.
crowdsourced money and raised money to
For
pay
his
his
jail?
police bond so that the police could release him to them.
Ah. Yeah,
I
this one. You
Wow.
beat you beat that one.
Wow. I can't. I fully cannot. Jungle justice is a huge problem, but this is a hilarious story. That is dedication to the cause. I really
yeah.
that is dedication. They were like, "We are going to lynch you no matter what
Yeah, we are
happens."
going
That
to
is
lynch you. And we're gonna crowdsource your bond.
It reminds me.
that
It reminds me of the guys
that's fast.
who were drunken and pissing in the streets who were forced to clean the mortuary. So
Laugh it out.
These are the stories. These are the stories
go
that
ahead,
make me
Adesua. What's
happy.
yours?
These are the stories that mine is not even mine is. I can't believe. I think Charles should have wrapped it up today. That's hilarious. No. So mine is about electricity in Nigeria. And the tariffs. Essentially, electricity has gotten more expensive for everyone, but the government tried to do something where they put people on bands.
Oh,
So band A, which is people in the highest,
Yeah.
richest areas, will pay the most. Band C or D will pay the least. And the idea was that band A will subsidize band B or band C. However, in typical Nigerian manner, the people in band A, some of them would pay to get moved down to band B or band C because it
Well,
was very expensive. It's a very expensive band to be on. And the idea was they said you get 20 hours if you're in band A, and then so you pay X amount. And then band B would get maybe 18 or 16 hours. I can't remember what it is, but that's how it goes, down, down, down. But we weren't even getting the 20 in band A. I can speak because I'm a band A mafian. We weren't getting the 20. My dad has put solar on the roofs of all the houses because now we're on inverter. But funny thing that happened 2 days ago, it's not that funny, but slightly funny, is that the deputy governor of Lagos State, Obafemi Hamzat, said that his electricity bill went from 2.7 million naira to over 20 million naira, to about 26 million naira in 1 month. And that he actually went to Eco Disco, which is the distribution company, and was like, please give me a prepaid meter. I don't want estimated billing. This bill is too high. And the disco frustrated him. That's the deputy governor.
how how
It's the deputy governor cannot get a meter.
how about
What
Adesua?
what can I do?
How different is that from Charles's story? I mean, it's just same.
I, I mean, at the same time, the Gencos are threatening to shut down, that they're being owed 4 trillion naira. I don't know who's owing you this money because you're not even giving me lights. But the deputy governor, has been frustrated from getting a meter. Not not that he
No,
wants to pay for what
he's
he's
been
using, and
paying
he's being
for the
frustrated.
other guys in A, B, and C. That's the whole point.
No, but it's really bad. Some people's monthly bills are now larger than their rent for 1 year for electricity, and this is already a country with energy poverty. So it's a very sad story. But I just thought it was hilarious that
Ru-
the governor can't get a meter. The deputy governor, sorry, of Lagos State cannot get a meter in his
well,
own
tell him
residence.
welcome to Nigeria. Um, Mi- Mine is again out of South Africa, and just when you have sort of given up and you're wondering what's going to happen next, somehow South Africa always manages to craft the right responses to situations. You see that they have thought through and are going about an issue thoroughly. What am I talking about? It's the appointment of Mcebisi Jonas as a special envoy for South Africa to deal with all of these issues about Trump, the US, and the challenges that they're facing. South Africa teaches us that irrespective of what happens, you choose your best minds and you put your best step forward. They didn't panic. They didn't go into a shouting match with the US. They didn't. They kept calm, cool heads, and then have deployed someone who I think is the best mind suited for this purpose. And I actually think the
Nice. We did
no,
panic,
but
but thank you.
you know what that means, Firio. That actually, if I was the AU or the African continent generally or AFCTA, I would actually ride on Jonas's back as a way of trying to solve some of these challenges that are coming back. Get the guys to understand Africa better. Look at it because I know. Jonas a bit, and I know his temperament, but also his intellectual depth, his diplomatic skills. That's the kind of step Africa needs to put forward. And on that note, I want to thank all of you bad natives for being here with us, and remind our
Thank you.
listeners subscribe and then share our podcast with other guys. People need to understand where Africa meets the world. It's with the bad natives. Thank you and goodbye.